One of the absolute number one questions I'm asked is, how do I price work? How do I figure out my pricing? Am I pricing too high? Am I pricing too low? So let's talk about pricing. And to do this, I want to keep it as absolutely simple as possible. So let's talk about it from the frame of maintenance. So mowing lawns, trimming bushes, hand weeding beds. But the core of what I'm talking about will work for landscape and pest control and fertilization weed control. But there's another level up when you're thinking about pricing those services versus pricing maintenance. And the reason for that is in maintenance, you're predominantly selling time. Whereas when you get into fertilization weed control, now you have some chemical cost. When you get into design build or landscape, now we've got plant material cost and dump fees and all these other expenses. And so again, for simplicity, let's focus on maintenance. The idea that you are selling time. And that concept right there is one of the most important things that we need to get crystal clear on. So let's talk about selling time and then we'll dig into pricing. So when I say selling time, I want to make sure you realize and understand what business you're really in. You're in the business of selling time. You're in the business of partnering with a team member, someone that wants to join your company and renting them out to the public. So you find an individual that is willing to work for $14 an hour. That's what you're going to pay them per man hour or per hour for every hour they work. Now, you have some additional costs on top of that $14, often referred to as burden. So you have payroll costs, you have potentially workers' comp, you have a variety of additional expenses that are layered on top of that $14 an hour. So in our example, let's just say once you build in all the additional costs that you really have to pay, even though they get $14 an hour, there's additional cost to you for that employee. Let's call it $18 an hour. So the business you're in is you're in the business of taking that individual and renting them to Miss Smith to mow her lawn, or renting them to a commercial property to mow their lawn or trim their bushes or perform a service. So the market says, hey, I need my lawn mowed. Will you rent me an employee? Now, they want you to manage that employee. You're managing them. You're doing you're making everything happen, but you're essentially renting them. You're paying them $18 an hour or the equivalent with the added expenses. And then you're reselling them for some amount of money. Maybe that's $36, so it's double what you pay them. Or maybe it's $60, or maybe it's $100. A lot of that in terms of what you can get has to do with what the market will bear. What will the homeowner or the business pay? So in our example, we're renting an individual at $18 an hour, and we're managing lots of people, and we're renting those people out to the market, and we're marking them up. And I will tell you right off the bat that if you're paying $18 an hour, renting them out for $36 an hour is not enough, because there's all kinds of other expenses that have to be paid for before you get any profit from that $36 an hour that you'd be renting them out for. And so maybe we're renting this individual out for $50 an hour. That seems to me to be a more reasonable number, but that's the business you're in. You are in the business of renting people out, selling time, all right? So now that we've established that, let's think about how we price. What we don't want to do is just go out and ask people, competitors, what do you charge to mow a lawn? What do you charge for fertilization weed control? Now, I recommend that because it allows you to start gathering data and knowledge. It's absolutely wise to figure out, what do your competitors charge? The dilemma is that there's also risk in that. So if, for example, here's a perfect illustration. If you were to ask, what does it cost to have a half acre mowed? And someone said it's $50, your competitor charges $50, and that's all the information you have, you might have a 21-inch mower, and you might go out and push mow half an acre for $50. Well, you don't really make a lot of money doing that. What you may not have known is that your competitor had a 61-inch deck rider, and that's how they can charge $50 an hour. So don't get too stuck on any of the numbers I'm giving you. I'm using them for illustration purposes. My point is, in the absence of information, if you copy someone else's pricing, you might find yourself in a lot of trouble, meaning you're not making any money or you're losing money. In the example I just gave, the absence of information was they are using a 61-inch deck mower and you're using a push mower. There's other examples. of why your pricing, if you match someone else's pricing, you might find yourself in a bad spot. How well have their team members been trained? How long have their team members been working at that company? Meaning they've learned the processes and procedures. How much experience do the team members have? What kind of equipment are they using? I mean, we can even get into things like, have they been able to make those rates work because they don't have many non-billable wasted hours in their business? They're very efficient. So when you're paying a team member for 40 hours a week, the majority of that 40 hours is actually billable time versus maybe at your company, you're driving all the time. And so in your hourly rate, you are only billing 20 hours of a 40-hour week, and the other 20 hours is completely wasted. And so if you copy someone else's price, there's a whole number of variables that might not have been considered where that pricing is actually not profitable for you. It's profitable for them because of how their business is set up, okay? And that's why it's dangerous to simply ask the market what's the price and then copy it. Now, you should do that because you want to understand it. The more important number to ask, or the most important number to ask, is what do you tend to make per hour mowing lawns? $45 an hour, $50 an hour, $60 an hour? What do you tend to make per hour doing fertilization weed control? $65 an hour, $70, $80 an hour? That number's valuable. So hold that in the back of your mind and let's kind of continue on. So the way I recommend that you go about figuring out pricing in your market is you do start with an understanding of what your competitors are charging, whether that's you're price shopping the market, you're asking individuals that use a lawn company, hey, what do they charge you to maintain the property? So you're gathering that information. But for you, and that's sort of a starting point, but for you, what you have to now do is you've got to go do some work and you've got to actually do some time tests yourself. So that sounds fancy, but it's not really that fancy. What I mean by time tests is, and let me just lay it out as an order of operation. So let's just imagine you're mowing a lawn, you're mowing it by yourself, you're trying to figure out this pricing thing, and so you pull up in your truck, and when you arrive in front of the property, you turn off the ignition. When you turn off the ignition, you write down the start time. You get out, you unload the truck, you mow the lawn, you do the line trimming and the edging, and then you blow everything off. And if there's anything else, you do that. You load the truck back up. When you get back in the truck and you've finished any notes you need to make about that property, and you go to turn the ignition back on, you write down the stop time. So let's just say you arrived at 1 p.m. and you left at 2 p.m. That means you worked for 1 hour. Assuming you were the only person on the crew, that is 1 man hour. Now let's say it was you and a helper, and it was the same amount of time. You got there at 1, you both got back in the truck at 2. That was 1 hour from 1 o'clock to 2 o'clock, but this time there were 2 of you, so that means there were 2 man hours. So you now know, we'll stick with the example of 2 individuals on the property, you now know that that job takes 2 man hours. Now in time, what you might find is that depending on the time of year, you might be able to move more quickly. For example, spring might take longer because the grass is taller, or maybe it's damp in the morning, or maybe it's cooler weather, so the grass has a lot more moisture in it, and so you move slower. There's a variety of variables. Also, you may learn the property and you may become efficient over time, or maybe you become better over time at working with your coworker, and the 2 of you simply become more efficient. Instead of it being a 2-man-hour job, eventually it's a 1 hour and 45-minute job. But over time, there are these variables that might change and bring down the total time, and that's a good little side lesson to know about. But in my example here, this is a 2-man-hour job, meaning it takes 2 hours to do this work. So now, if you happen to know that the market on average charges about $45 a man hour, then to price that work, and frankly, you know that that's a profitable number for you, then to price that work, the calculation is as simple as $45 times 2 man hours, that's a $90 job. And so you need to price that job at $90. If it was just you and you did it in 1 hour, then it would be $45 times 1, so it would be a $45 an hour job. Something else to know about pricing is as you add people to a job, the job becomes less efficient. So the most efficient means of production is 1 person. Now there's a little tiny argument that maybe 2 people are more efficient than 1, for the simple argument that 2 people working together might push each other. When one individual's tired, maybe they take more breaks, but when they have a coworker, maybe the 2 of them together keep each other going. But I will argue strongly that past 2 individuals, there's a decline in efficiency. So as an example, if it would take one person to do a job in 1 hour, it may or may not take them exactly 2 hours. It could be a little more or a little bit less. But once you go to 3 people, it's probably not going to still just be 1 hour per person. Feel like I didn't explain that very well, but hopefully you caught the gist of that, meaning that there's a decline in efficiency as you add more people to the job. Okay? And so you've got to consider that when you're pricing. So inside this $45 a man hour, because this is the magic number that you've got to figure out. I in a sense, just gave you the very simplistic way to figure out how to price something. You need to know how long it's going to take. Now, you could perform the work. I'm going to come back to that previous thought. You could perform the work and figure out how much it takes and then calculate a price. But if you don't know if you can't perform the work before you price it, which is the situation for most of us, what you have to then start to do is learn about properties. So for example, if you've got to pay it, you need some variables. So as an example, in mowing, if you learn that on average, a 4,000 square foot property takes 2 individuals 20 minutes, so 40 man minutes, then next time you encounter a 4,000 square foot property, you'll know it's a 40-minute job, 2 men, 20 minutes, times $45 a man hour in my previous example, and that will allow you to arrive at the pricing. But of course, it's not quite that simple because from one property to the next, you have variables. So in the example of mowing, we might have trampolines, we might have swimming pools, we might have lots of trees. Do those trees drop lots of leaves? So you've got to learn how these different variables impact pricing, which means they impact time. What I wish I could do is just give you that magic answer and that simple formula and everything would be wonderful and you could price every job from this point forward. But the reality is it doesn't work that way. And so you have to understand the fundamentals of pricing and how it works so that you can start learning them and you can start looking for patterns. And I gave you an example of pattern, square footage. Or another pattern might be number of sprinkler heads, rotors versus pop-ups. Or another pattern might be the number of zones, or number of trees, or the number of trees in a property plus the caliper, or the diameter of the drip line. On and on. You can look for it, in pest control, the square footage of the home. House cleaning, the number of bathrooms, the number of bedrooms. Like there's all these, once you start to find a pattern, you can start to come up with standardized pricing, and that's a big deal. And so that's a learning game initially. And the thing you have to most learn is how long does it take me to do certain types of work, to mow lawns of this size, or to trim bushes of this size, round versus square versus long rectangles, or round, or ornamental rounds versus small bushes. You get the idea. So everything's a factor of time, and we have to learn the time. And once we then know the time, we multiply that by our hourly rate. Now this hourly rate example, let's go to that. So in that hourly rate, when I use the example of 45 a man hour, and you'll see that a lot of people in the mowing world charge about 45 a man hour, and it can vary. Some will charge less, some will charge 60, it's all over the board. Well, it's all over the board for a variety of reasons. One, what will the market support? So one thing you'll learn is that the market supports more to do fertilization weed control than it does to do mowing. It supports more to do pest control than it does for hand weeding beds. And by supports, meaning that it will pay more per hour. So when you have an individual doing fertilization and weed control, that one person per man hour is making more money than one person on a mowing crew because the market will pay more for that service. The market doesn't necessarily understand that. The homeowner doesn't say, oh, I'm willing to pay $65 an hour for fertilization weed control, but $45 for mowing. That's not how they think. It's just that's the pricing that's standard in the market, that the market hasn't drove that pricing down further. And so on average, you're able to sell work at that price, at that hourly rate. Now inside that hourly rate, you've got to cover the payroll. Remember my example of $14 an hour plus the burden. Then you've got to be able to cover your expenses, your fuel, your supplies. You've got to be able to cover your truck, your equipment, your rent on your building. All of that has to get packaged into the hourly rate. Now that is the ultimate. You ultimately want to get to a place where you understand how all the component expenses of your business, marketing, your fixed expenses, your variable expenses, your COGS, all these terms, you ultimately want to fully understand how all of that together should define your rate. And that would be the better video for me to make. The problem is nobody will follow that advice because for most, earlier in your business, it's too complicated to understand that stuff. You don't even know the industry yet well enough. You don't know the business well enough. But eventually, when you get to a place where you really understand your financials, you can think about pricing in a different way. But the reality is that 95% of your competitors are going to think about pricing. If they think about pricing at all properly, they're thinking about it the way I'm describing it, and they're not thinking about it the way I just started to allude to, which is building the price from the ground up. And so that's why I'm focused on the more simplistic. So you've got to figure out two things here. You've got to figure out how long does it take to do the property in time, and then you multiply that time by the rate. And that's the second thing you've got to figure out. What should that rate be for your particular service? And in that rate, you've got to cover all the expenses I just described, as well as your non-billable expenses, the time incurred driving the truck. Because remember, while you're driving the truck, you're paying payroll. Okay? And all that goes into your hourly rate. So that's the thing to focus on, the hourly rate. Figure that out. And you do that by talking to people inside your market, figuring out what they're charging, and also thinking about what you're willing to do the work for. And so I can't tell you what that rate is, but I'll give you a guide that in a lot of markets, you'll see mowing rates in the $40 an hour to $65 an hour range, and it varies. In commercial, you'll see the hourly rate go even lower than that. I tend to think more in the residential world. In fertilization weed control, you're going to see the rates be a good bit higher than that. Pest control is going to be even higher than that. Irrigation, we see a lot of hourly rates in the $65 to $95 an hour rate. Again, those are just some examples. And so you've got to figure out what that hourly rate is and then multiply it by the time. Boy, there's so much I'm leaving out. There's so much more you should know. It's complicated. I've probably left you with a lot of questions, but what I've just described is the foundational, simplistic understanding that you start on with to get you started, and then you build on top of it. And a lot of this is just about doing some time and getting out there and understanding the properties. And the way you understand properties is by tracking time. If you're not tracking start and stop time, you'll never learn the time. And I would argue that if your teams are not tracking start and stop time, they'll never learn the association of doing the work with the time. And once you learn the association, you'll be able to look at the job and you'll be able to guesstimate. Now that's a risky thing, but there are plenty of people that are really good at it because they've been doing the work for so long. The problem with guesstimating is that it's not scalable. It's something that you will be stuck doing for the rest of your life and you won't be able to hand that off. So in another video, we will talk about how do you take the business from guesstimating to actually being able to delegate estimating to someone else so that you can scale the business. I'll see you on the next video.